Well, at least most of us ran the clock forward last night. There's always somebody that forgets it. And that person's probably up about now thinking everything's great with the world. And then they want to realize, uh-oh, I'm late or early, whatever it may be in their case. Glad you're here. Beautiful day the Lord's given us. Let's begin with the word of prayer. And Mike, would you lead some prayer, please? Amen. Over the past, it's been a couple of weeks ago, most of us, if you keep up with what's going on in the county, there was a man that was convicted of murder. And after he was convicted of murder, his sentence was capital punishment or the death row. It's where he was sent to. And I thought this morning we might look at that because sometimes people have questions. Is capital punishment right? Is it something that should be carried out? And you may have certain, you got certain states who say, no, you don't do it here. And then certain states that do. And well, it just goes on a little bit. But even among Christians, it may be that some Christians say, well, it shouldn't be carried out. And some say it should. And so there's some questions. And the Bible does, I think, speak about it. And we're going to look at that this morning and try to have an understanding maybe what it means. But when it comes to capital punishment, there's several questions that people have about it, even Christians. And one is capital punishment morally right? Is it the moral thing to do? Is capital punishment scripturally right? That's what the Christian would want to consider. Can capital punishment be administered in an imperfect society? That one's a good question to answer. Do we ever make any mistakes? And we'll look at that in a minute. Does somebody ever go through and they're executed and then later realize, they're innocent? Can that happen? Does capital punishment deter crime? There's some say it does and some say it doesn't. It's not, for those that say it does, it's not a big difference, but they say in some cases it does. Is capital punishment cruel and unusual punishment? Well, if you're a person that's been, or had a family member that's been harmed in some way, and this person gets the capital punishment for their sentence, you might say there's no punishment that's cruel and unusual. Look what they did to my loved one. So what is cruel and unusual? And is capital punishment consistent with the biblical of love and forgiveness? So what does it say? What does Christ say about it? I thought we were supposed to love one another, forgive one another, and yet for capital punishment, I don't really see a whole lot of love there. I don't see a lot of forgiveness. So those are some questions that people ask concerning capital punishment. And good questions to ask and try to get a right answer from them. But here's some stats or maybe information. Since 1973 in the United States, 165 individuals have been exonerated that were on death row. 165. They were sentenced to death, and mainly because of DNA. Because DNA can really get down to if you did it or not for what DNA does, but 165 were found innocent after they were sentenced. And there have been those executed that were later found innocent. If you look on the Google that, and you have all kind of examples of folks here in the United States after they were executed. Family kept looking, people kept talking, kept investigating, and sure enough, that person was innocent. So here's somebody probably was claiming their innocence all along, but yet nobody would listen. So yes, there's your example of an imperfect society. We They don't always do everything right. From the history of capital punishment, we can find in 1750 BC, the Code of Hammurabi there that applied the death penalty to 25 different offenses. Some of them were corruption of government officials, sexual offenses, theft, murder, and the list just goes on of 25 different reasons why capital punishment could be administered. That's the Code of Hammurabi there. That's if you don't think about history, that they found this and a lot of laws and things they found about government and life during that time. So 1750, they were taking lives. Under the law of Moses, there's a list of things that one could receive the death penalty over. Murder, blasphemy, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, sorcery, witchcraft, cursing a parent, causing a pregnant woman to miscarry, failure to confine a goring ox, child sacrifice, Sabbath violations, false witnesses. You do any of that, and under the law of Moses, you could be stoned. They could stone you for that. So there's even the old law had reasons where one could die. Under the Roman law, they had defacing a coin. You think about that, defacing a coin. Or kidnapping, pickpocketing. Ones I don't have on here, trying to overthrow the government. Murder, of course, you could get that. And they had other laws, but you think defacing a coin? That sounds awful. Petty, but yet they would. I could understand kidnapping. Pickpocketing, that doesn't sound like a capital offense, but they did. They had these and others. That'd be a godly thing, how they looked at him. So if you defaced a coin, you defaced their God, yeah. Some other things here. In America, the first documented case of capital punishment was in 1622 when Daniel Frank was hung for stealing a calf. He stole a calf. In 1697, drowning was, as a method of execution, was abolished. Is that cruel and unusual? They would drown a person. That's in America. In 1769, there were 160 crimes punishable by death. Well, things have changed since that time, and mainly now it's you murder somebody, you could very well, if it's first degree, premeditated, you very well could, if you're in a state where it happens, it very well could happen. You could get the capital offense there. Here's some guidelines in the Old Testament. If Old Testament gave it the okay. If you did these certain crimes, well, here's the guidelines for it in Deuteronomy 17:6. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He should not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. So circumstantial evidence will not work. Not in the Bible, in the Old Testament. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses that would give testimony. And if you were one of those 2 or 3 witnesses, Deuteronomy 13:9, but you shall surely kill him, your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So if you're one of the 2 or 3 or who knows how many witnesses, and he's found guilty, and he's about to be stoned to death, that's the penalty, you had to throw the first stone. You had to throw the first stone. That's going to bring back a little bit what Christ says, with the woman caught in adultery. You who are without sin, there's more to it, you cast the first stone. The person who, what Christ is saying, that a person who saw her, who caught them in this adulterous act, you cast the first stone. He's referencing here this law here in Deuteronomy 13:9. But there's also more to that. We'll see in a moment about it. So there's the 2 guidelines. Had to have witnesses, plural. And those witnesses had to cast the first stone if it's by death by stoning. So now this question, can we base capital punishment today off the Old Testament? Can we? We don't live under the Old Testament anymore. So what about the New? What does it say about capital punishment? If we can't use the Old because we don't live under the Old. But here's what we got to do. We got to go back before the law of Moses came into effect. You know, you had the laws that dealt with, called the patriarchal age, from Adam up to Moses, the Mosaic age, the Mosaic laws, from Moses to Christ. What about the laws before there was Moses' law? What do those laws have to say? Well, those laws are generally looked at as being universal laws. And as we look at some of them, these laws never change. These laws will always be in effect. Genesis 9, 1 through 4. He gives several right here. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's a universal law. That's to never change. Be fruitful and multiply. That's what got the folks at the Tower of Babel in trouble. They didn't follow that. So God scattered them. In verse 2, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea that are given into your hand. There's the fear of animals and birds that have a people. God gave them a fear. Are there some animals that kill folks and eat them who aren't fearful of them? Yeah, that happens. You get out here somewhere and a tiger jumps on you. If you're in one of these Africa or somewhere and he's hungry, he's going to eat you. But under normal conditions, they're scared. That's why they fly off or run off from you. Verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. So he's telling them right here, whatever's walking around, you can eat it if you want to eat it. The green things, turnip greens, things like that, those good foods. If you want them, you can eat them. There's nothing off limits. I mean, it wasn't until Israel went into the wilderness that God began to put limits on what they could eat. That never applied to everybody, just to Israel. But here he's giving him a universal law. If you want to eat it, eat it. I won't check it out first. It may kill you, but you can eat it if you want to. And then verse 4, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. If that animal hasn't been bled, you don't eat it. You don't drink the blood of these animals. You don't do that. That's a universal law that God has set in place. And that's why even today, animals, when they go to the slaughterhouse, they're bled. They're bled. It's the way you do it. If you ever done any hog killing, or killing the cows years ago, you kill the pig, and first thing you do, you run that butcher knife up in the heart. Bleed him out, hang him upside down, let him bleed out. That's just the way you do it. Well, that's a universal law that God is saying. You make sure that the life is, or the blood is not in that animal. Verse 5, chapter 9 and verse 5. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he is made. So if you have an animal and it kills someone, you kill the animal. If you kill someone, and this is murder, well, your blood's to be shed as well. So there's a universal law that God's put in. You take somebody's life, murder, well, your life can be taken as well. And that's why during Moses' time, he gave the cities of refuge. There were 6 cities of refuge. If you accidentally killed somebody, you had to get to one of these cities until you were proven innocent. Because if you didn't get there, the next of kin of the person you killed accidentally could come and take your life. It'd be okay. You had to get to the city. You had to stay in the city until your innocence was proven. And then and only then you could leave. If you went there and, I'm tired of this place, I think I'll leave for a while. You went outside and he killed you. He's okay. So again, they had laws for that. But here in Genesis 9:5 and 6, you take somebody's life by murder, your life can be taken in return. In Genesis 9:11, this I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Let's talk about the flood. No more universal floods. In all of these universal laws, God has put this one in as well. No more floods. He gave us the rainbow, as we know, as a sign that wouldn't happen. And then in verse 12, Genesis 9:12, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I made between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. Perpetual. This is not going to change. What we just read here from verses 1 through verse 12, these universal laws, they don't change. God set them into place. That's the way it is to be. We have the flood that's never going to happen, and you have those others. That's never going to happen as well. So based on that, if a person wants to say capital punishment is biblical, you go back before the Ten Commandments was given, those laws, and you look at the universal laws that God gave, and it falls into that category. So there's where a person would go to find Scripture for capital punishment based in that. Any question about the universal laws? Well, what about Jesus? Did Jesus abolish capital punishment? Here in John 8:5 is where the woman was caught in adultery. She was brought out to be stoned. It was a test of Christ, is what it was about. And that's where Christ said, if you're without sin, cast the first stone. And they all left. And he goes to the woman, and he tells her, where's your accusers? I forgive you. She goes. She leaves. Well, that was a capital punishment crime that she committed, adultery. Here's what it says here in verse 8, chapter 8, verse 5. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. And when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. So some say, well, Jesus here, he's doing away with capital punishment because they could have killed her right there on the spot, but he wouldn't allow it. He said, you who's doing this has no sin, throw the stone. There's a word here in verse 7. The word without sin, without. That word is used one time in the New Testament, one time. And it means, it doesn't mean the person who is sinless Doesn't mean that. Who is sinless. Christ is not saying, now, the person here who doesn't have a sin in their life, you go ahead and cast that stone. That's not what he's saying. That word means, Christ is saying, you who are doing this by the law, you cast the stone. If you're doing this by the law, you cast the stone. What was wrong about this? What was wrong about this incident right here of these people? Where are the witnesses? Yeah. 2 or 3, where are they? It was a setup. You don't want to frame a guy here. There's another big one. Where's the man? You had to have both male and female. Both who were caught in this had to be brought forth. Where's he at? There's another one. It had to be done outside the walls of the city. You didn't stone anybody inside the walls of the city. So Christ is saying to them, you who are doing this by the law. Anybody doing it by the law? You cast the first stone. And there's that deal, casting the first stone. If you're the witness, that's what he's pointing to, you do it. But they couldn't. They didn't have witnesses. They didn't have the man. It was a setup. They were doing it in the wrong place. There was nothing right about this. If they had had this, if it wasn't a setup, and if they had the man, and they had the witnesses, Christ would have said, go ahead, follow the law. That's what the law says to do. But they didn't have it. So it's not, he's saying sinless, the sinless person. None of us could throw a stone if that be the case. But the person who is doing this according to the law, you throw the stone. You start it. And that's where he's going with it. So again, there's based on one word. And the only time it's used. And it's good that God put it in there just for this reason. Because if it means without sin, sinlessness, then we can't make any judgments on anything. I can't even tell you that what you're doing is wrong. You can't do it. It's sinlessness. But Christ based it on the law. And the same thing is true of us. If we see something going on and we want to help that person, there's ways to go about doing it. First of all, we're not to be doing the same thing they're doing. Don't go up here, Matthew 7. Don't go out here and start judging somebody you're doing the same thing. You don't do that. So there's some ways that even God has put it for us, even today. We can't make the final call, of course, on sin, but we can be fruit inspectors. Fruit inspectors. We don't want that person to lose their salvation or lose their soul. So we do what we can to show them their error of their way. In Romans 13:4, again, we don't know really what is the word that's being meant here. For he is God's minister. He's talking here about the government. The government is God's minister to you for good. For if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. You do evil, the law of the land is to convict you and punish you. That's what he's speaking about. We should fear that. Of course, we know things have gotten really out of hand today as far as punishment goes. But yet, we should fear government rule if it's run properly by God's way. But the word sword there, some wonder, what does it mean? Does that mean the symbol of authority? I think that's what he's speaking of. Some will say he's meaning capital punishment. The sword, that's the instrument that was used to kill. It could be. Or it may be just the sword is how one is to be killed through the capital punishment. I think the sword there is just meaning the authority of the government. But some look at it and they begin to wonder. But certainly we are to obey the laws of the land as long as they don't go against the Word of God. And then last year we have Paul. And Paul talks about his conviction. He was falsely convicted, of course. And look at Paul's thought on this, Acts 25:11. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. So Paul is saying here, if I've done something worthy of death, go ahead and take my life. He's in agreement with it, in agreement with the death penalty. And that's what he's trying to put on them. You don't have anything to accuse me of. But if it were, go ahead and take my life. So I think Paul is saying here that there's some crimes that are worthy of death, and there's some that are not. So if he committed it, a crime, then let him go ahead and suffer the penalty of death. So there's the capital punishment, where I think we go with it. Again, if you don't, some may agree, some may not. Whatever. But I think for those who want to go with it, say it's okay today, then there's your verses, and of course if the evidence is there, and we have a lot of good ways today to try to find guilt, and we can do it a lot better than we could just 20 years ago or 25, ever since this DNA stuff gets out. And they're coming up with even different ways they can do it now. They can take the DNA of a relative and track that thing down somehow and show guilt. They can do that. That's been used on occasions. So the man's getting pretty smart. It's hard to get away with something. Generally, people make mistakes when they try to do such, but just don't do it. That's the best way. Love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. Anything else this morning? All right, we'll conclude there. About time for the bell.